December 25th, 1995. Beverly Hills, California. 3:14 a.m. Christmas morning. In a private room at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, Dean Martin, the man the world knew as the king of cool, the effortless crooner who made everything look easy, opened his eyes one final time. His daughter Deanna was holding his hand when he whispered 7 words that shattered everything she thought she knew about her father. I was never the man you thought I was. For 50 years, Dean Martin had been America's favorite drinking buddy, the smooth-voiced charmer who seemed perpetually relaxed, perpetually amused, perpetually drunk. His image was so carefully crafted, so perfectly maintained, that it became indistinguishable from reality. The glass of scotch that never left his hand during performances, the slightly slurred speech, the casual, don't-give-a-damn attitude that made him seem like the coolest man alive. But in those final hours, as his body failed and the performance was finally over, Dean Martin did something he had avoided for half a century. He told the truth. What he revealed to his family in those last conversations wasn't about scandals or affairs or Hollywood feuds. It was something far more devastating, the confession of a man who had spent his entire adult life playing a character so convincingly that he had slowly disappeared inside it. This is not the story of Dean Martin you think you know. This is the story of Dino Crocetti, the frightened immigrant's son who created Dean Martin to survive, then spent the rest of his life trapped inside his own creation, unable to find his way back to the person he used to be. To understand what Dean Martin became, you must first understand who Dino Crocetti was. Born on June 7, 1917, in Steubenville, Ohio, to Italian immigrant parents, Dino grew up in a world where being Italian meant being other. His father, Gaetano, was a barber who spoke broken English. His mother, Angela, spoke almost no English at all. Young Dino didn't speak English himself until he started school at age 5, and even then, he struggled with a stutter that made him the target of mockery. I was ashamed, he later told his son, Richie, in a rare moment of honesty in the 1980s. Ashamed of my parents' accents, ashamed of our neighborhood, ashamed of being poor. I wanted to be anyone but Dino Crocetti. That shame drove him. He dropped out of school in 10th grade, working as a bootlegger's delivery boy during Prohibition, then as a card dealer in illegal gambling joints, then as a steel mill worker, anything to escape the poverty and the ethnic stigma. But it was boxing that first showed him the power of reinvention. Fighting as Kid Crochet, he learned that the crowd didn't care who you were. They only cared about the show you put on. In 1939, he started singing in local clubs, and that's when Dino Crocetti truly disappeared. A bandleader told him his name was too Italian for the mainstream circuit, so he became Dean Martin, a name that sounded American, sophisticated, unthreatening. He smoothed out his accent, eliminated his stutter through sheer force of will, and created a persona, the relaxed crooner, the guy who made everything look effortless. But beneath that carefully constructed surface, Dino Crocetti never fully went away. He just went into hiding. Stop here, what comes next changes everything. The performance perfected. 1946-1956. The Rat Pack years. Dean Martin's breakthrough came in 1946 when he partnered with comedian Jerry Lewis. For 10 years, they were the biggest act in American entertainment. Movies, television, sold-out shows in Las Vegas and across the country. Dean played the straight man, the smooth singer who provided the romantic counterpoint to Jerry's manic energy. But even then, the real Dean Martin was already disappearing. His son, Dean Paul, later recalled in his memoir, "Even at home, I'm not sure I ever met the real man. He was always performing, always on. The relaxed guy with the drink, the easy laugh, that was the only version he knew how to be anymore." The Martin-Lewis split in 1956 should have ended Dean's career. Industry insiders predicted Jerry would thrive, while Dean would fade into obscurity. Instead, the opposite happened. Dean Martin became bigger than ever, hit records like That's Amore and Ain't That a Kick in the Head, starring roles in films, and then the ultimate validation, joining Frank Sinatra's inner circle, the Rat Pack. The Rat Pack years, roughly 1958 to 1965, cemented Dean Martin's image for eternity. Performing at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas alongside Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, and Joey Bishop, Dean perfected the persona that would define him. The guy who walked on stage with a drink, who seemed perpetually buzzed, who treated everything, fame, money, women, with amused detachment. The glass was always in his hand, Sammy Davis Jr. later recalled. But what nobody knew, what Dean worked very hard to keep secret, was that it was usually apple juice. The whole drunk persona was an act. And it was brilliant because it made him seem completely harmless, completely non-threatening. But it also made it impossible for anyone to really know him. This is where the official biographies quietly skip forward. The drinking was fake. The loneliness was real. Here's what the public never understood. Dean Martin wasn't a heavy drinker. In private, he rarely drank alcohol. His beverage of choice was actually ginger ale or apple juice in a rocks glass. The slurred speech, the slightly unfocused eyes, the casual looseness, that was acting, and he was so good at it that even his closest collaborators sometimes forgot it was a performance. But the act came with a devastating cost. To maintain the illusion of the eternally relaxed, couldn't-care-less Dean Martin, the real man had to remain hidden. He couldn't show vulnerability. He couldn't show that he cared deeply about his work, that he was actually a perfectionist in the recording studio, that beneath the casual exterior was someone who felt things intensely. Dad built this fortress, his daughter Diana later wrote in her memoir, "Memories are made of this." The fortress was called Dean Martin, and once he built it, he could never come out. Because if he did, if he showed real emotion or real pain, the whole image would collapse. So he stayed inside, and we stayed outside, and none of us really knew each other. The loneliness intensified after his son Dean Paul Martin died in a plane crash in 1987. Dean Paul, a talented pilot and actor, was killed when his F-4 Phantom II fighter jet crashed into a mountain during a military training exercise. He was 35 years old. For the first time in his public life, Dean Martin couldn't maintain the performance. Friends reported that he wept openly at the funeral, shocking behavior for a man who had built his entire image on emotional unavailability. He withdrew from public life, canceling his concert residency at Bally's in Las Vegas, one of the most lucrative contracts in entertainment. After Dean Paul died, something broke in Dad, Richie Martin recalled. The performance ended, but the problem was, he'd been performing for so long that he didn't know who he was without it. He'd spent 50 years being Dean Martin. Dino Crocetti was gone, and now Dean Martin was gone too. There was nothing left. But the most shocking moment was still ahead. The final confession, December 1995. In his last months, Dean Martin, now 78 years old, suffering from lung cancer and emphysema, began talking to his children in ways he never had before. The smooth, unflappable persona had finally cracked. What emerged was a man full of regret, trying desperately to communicate truths he had spent a lifetime hiding. He told me he wished he'd been a different kind of father, Deanna Martin revealed in later interviews. He said he'd been so busy being Dean Martin that he forgot to be dad. He said every joke, every performance, every casual gesture was something he'd calculated to maintain the image. Nothing was spontaneous. Nothing was real. But the most devastating confession came on Christmas Eve, 1995. The family had gathered at Cedars-Sinai, knowing the end was near. Dean was drifting in and out of consciousness, but during one lucid moment, he asked his children to come close. According to Richie Martin's account, published years later, Dean said, "I need you to understand something. The man you saw on stage, on television, that wasn't me. That was a character I created because Dino Crocetti wasn't good enough. He was too Italian, too poor, too scared. So I buried him. I buried him so deep I couldn't find him again, even when I wanted to." He paused, struggling for breath, then continued. "I thought if I could just be Dean Martin perfectly enough, if I could make everyone love Dean Martin, then maybe I could learn to love him too. But you can't love a performance. You can only love a person. And I stopped being a person 50 years ago." There was a long silence. Then he said the words that Deanna would later describe as the most honest thing her father ever told her. "I was never the man you thought I was. I'm sorry you never got to meet the man I used to be. I'm sorry I never gave you the chance." Early on Christmas morning, December 25th, 1995, Dean Martin, born Dino Crocetti, died. The cause of death was listed as acute respiratory failure. But his children knew the truth. He died of a broken heart, having spent his final hours confronting the cost of a lifetime spent performing. And this is the part the studios never wanted revealed, the industry that created the myth. Dean Martin's tragedy wasn't unique. It was systemic. The Hollywood studio system of the 1940s through 1960s was a machine designed to create products, not support people. Actors weren't artists. They were investments. And investments needed to be carefully managed, carefully branded, carefully controlled. For Dean Martin, that meant the creation and maintenance of a persona that bore only surface resemblance to reality. The studios loved the drunk act because it was profitable. It made him seem fun, non-threatening, the guy everyone wanted to party with. They actively discouraged him from showing depth or complexity because that might confuse the brand. The studio executives literally told him to keep drinking on camera, director Billy Wilder recalled in an interview years later. Even though they knew it was mostly an act, they wanted the audience to believe it was real. They wanted Dean Martin the character, not whatever complicated human being might exist underneath. That same system discouraged genuine emotional connection. Dean's multiple marriages, 4 in total, were treated by the industry as publicity opportunities or liabilities, never as actual human relationships. When his marriage to his second wife, Jean Beager, began falling apart in the late 1960s, studio publicists advised him to maintain appearances for the sake of his image, keeping him trapped in an unhappy situation for years. The industry also isolated him. The Rat Pack camaraderie that looked so genuine on stage was largely performance. Sinatra and Dean were friends, but even that relationship was mediated through their public personas. Sinatra later admitted he never really knew what Dean was thinking or feeling. "He was the most private man I ever met," Sinatra said, "even when you were sitting right next to him. He was somewhere else, somewhere none of us could reach." After Dean Paul's death in 1987, when Dean needed support most, the industry had nothing to offer him but another contract, another performance opportunity. They couldn't conceive of him as a grieving father. They could only see him as Dean Martin, the product, who needed to get back on stage. The real cruelty was that the industry's treatment of Dean wasn't malicious. It was indifferent. They didn't set out to destroy the person in favor of the persona. They simply didn't care about the person at all. As long as Dean Martin, the product, kept generating revenue, Dino Crocetti's suffering was irrelevant. The man behind the myth. What makes Dean Martin's story particularly heartbreaking is that glimpses of the real person, the one he tried so hard to hide, occasionally broke through. And those moments reveal someone far more interesting and complex than the manufactured image. He was deeply generous, quietly paying medical bills and rent for struggling musicians and crew members, always anonymously. He was a devoted cook who found peace in making traditional Italian meals, the recipes his mother had taught him, connecting him to the heritage he had publicly downplayed. He was an obsessive golfer who valued those hours on the course because they were the only times he didn't have to perform. His children recall moments, rare but cherished, when the mask would slip. Diana remembers her father singing Italian lullabies to her when she couldn't sleep, his voice soft and unguarded in a way it never was publicly. Richie remembers finding his father crying alone in his study one night, looking at old photographs from Steubenville, mourning a version of himself that no longer existed. The saddest thing, Deanna later reflected, was that the real dad, the one we got tiny glimpses of, was so much more interesting than Dean Martin the character. He was thoughtful, deeply emotional, sometimes funny, in ways that had nothing to do with the cool persona, but he was so convinced that Dino Crocetti wasn't good enough that he kept him locked away. And by the time he was ready to let him out, it was too late. He couldn't find him anymore. The story of Dean Martin is not a story about a drunk who made it big. It's a story about what we lose when we create a public self so complete, so convincing, that it consumes the private self entirely. It's about an industry that rewarded performance over authenticity, that valued the product over the person, and that left countless artists hollowed out, wondering who they were, beneath the image they'd spent a lifetime maintaining. Dean Martin's final confession, "I was never the man you thought I was," wasn't just addressed to his family. It was addressed to all of us, the millions who loved Dean Martin without ever wondering about Dino Crocetti, who enjoyed the performance without considering its cost. We wanted the King of Cool, so he gave us the King of Cool, even when it meant sacrificing the frightened, hopeful, complicated human being underneath. We preferred the myth to the man, and by the time we might have wanted to know the man, he was gone, disappeared so thoroughly into the character he'd created that even he couldn't find his way back. What do we owe the artists who entertain us? Do we have a responsibility to see past the performance, to recognize the person behind the persona? Or is the artist's choice to hide themselves a kind of contract? They give us the image they want us to see, and we're not supposed to look any deeper? Dean Martin spent 50 years making sure we never looked deeper. And then, in his final hours, he told us we should have. That the real tragedy wasn't that he died, but that he disappeared long before, vanished into a character that was successful and beloved, but ultimately empty. As his daughter Diana later wrote, "On Christmas morning 1995, Dean Martin died. But the truth is, Dino Crocetti died decades earlier, suffocated by the weight of a performance that never ended. What passed away that morning was just the last remnant of a man who had been gone for a very long time." Today, we remember that final confession, not as an indictment, but as an invitation. An invitation to see the artists we love as complete human beings, not just the characters they play. An invitation to create a culture where performers don't have to sacrifice their authentic selves to achieve success. An invitation to look behind the mask before it's too late. Because somewhere, in some smoky club or recording studio or film set, there's another frightened kid trying to become someone else, someone cooler, someone more lovable. And maybe, if we learn from Dean Martin's story, we can help them understand that who they already are is enough. That's amore. That's the tragedy. That's the truth. Dean Martin couldn't tell us until the performance was finally over.